This is 32,000 planted. It has 80 units of N on it. The phosphate that I use, I didn't actually say this, but I do apply once every 4 years some compost. And that basically takes care of my mineral needs. And then I just balance out with nitrogen based on soil tests.
The focus of any farmer and rancher should be, how do you work with nature instead of against it? You look at what nature's trying to tell you, and then you adapt based on that. So, is everyone familiar with the 6 soil health principles? Everybody familiar with those? We're going to talk about those over the next 2 days. The first thing, when we go consult on a farm or ranch, is we run through those principles. How is that farmer or rancher applying the principle? So the first principle, and one that was added here recently, is the principle of context. Are you farming and ranching in your context? And that context is going to be different for every farm or ranch, no matter where you're at. We all have an ecological context. That's Joe's farm is located here, very southern, southeastern North Dakota. It has certain soil types, certain weather, gets certain amount of moisture per year, varies a bit, sometimes hail, unfortunately, but that's part of it. That's Joe's context, ecological context. Now, one of the things I come out and say right away, are we farming and ranching in that ecological context? I did a week worth of workshops around Wisconsin, and I asked the farmers there, are you farming in your ecological context? Oh yeah, we're all farming in our ecological context. I said, really? Are you in a cool season environment or a warm season environment in Wisconsin? Joe, are you a cool season or warm season environment?
You tell me. I'd say in between.
It's a cool season environment, and the reason we know that is if you go into Joe's native prairie pastures, it's going to be a majority cool season dominant. Now, yes, there is a warm season component. So if we're going to farm in that context, do we want cool season species, warm season species? Some of both, right? But we want more cool seasons than warm seasons if we're going to keep our soils functioning properly. In Wisconsin, the only crops I saw were corn and beans. They were really far out of context. You know, they're all warm season crops in a cool season environment. Don't get me wrong, I'm not telling Joe not to plant his corn or beans. He can do that. But what Joe's trying to do is he's planting the cool season species. He does those cereals, those cool season broadleafs. You got to take that into account. Okay, second principle. What is it? Come on, people. Yeah, minimize disturbance. Exactly. So least amount of mechanical, chemical disturbance possible. And Joe talked about back at the lodge how he can often go a year without that chemical disturbance. We don't realize how huge that is in agriculture to limit those chemical disturbances, especially tillage. I mean, if you're going to come in and do a tillage pass in these fields, you've literally set yourself back 10 years, okay? And I know organic producers, we work with a lot of organic producers. They're going to do some tillage, but how do we minimize it? Make it as seldom as possible within your context. And then one of the things we're really seeing, the vast majority of farms that we consult on are over-applying nutrients, not just by a little bit. Okay, currently we're approaching 33 million acres we're actively consulting on. That's a lot of acres, 46 different states, okay? How many soil tests do you think we've taken on those nearly 33 million acres that are deficient in enough nutrients to hinder profitable crop production? That's exactly right. How many of you work with agronomists who perform what's called a TND, total nutrient digestion test? Okay, you need to fire your agronomists because they don't have your best interest at heart. We do that on every farm that we consult on because we want to show the farmer there's plenty of nutrients in the soil. The problem isn't from the lack of nutrients. The problem's an availability issue. And so how do you make nutrients available? How do we make them available? Yeah, bingo. Biology, exactly. Got to have the biology. So we do a suite of tests to determine what biology do you have, where's it at, and how do we realize our goal is not to get to zero nutrient input necessarily, but how do we minimize it? And Joe said only 80 units for 160 bushel corn. You know, that's pretty good. 50, half a pound of N per bushel. Come on, that's pretty good, right? Right? So how do we, but can Joe do even better? Hell yeah, there's no doubt. I'll put the pressure on him right now. Yeah, okay. So that's the second principle, minimize those disturbances. Third principle, what is it? Cover, armor on the soil. How are we doing here? Now, I'm willing to bet, obviously, we're lacking armor in this field. Joe is trying with the 60-inch twin rows and going with the covers in between, but this last year was...
It was a 60 bushel soybean crop.
60 bushel soybean crop. So we were producing nitrogen with that bean crop, and one of the issues there, obviously, is the lack of residue following beans. And now we don't want too much armor that it's tying up that nutrient release for this corn crop, but I honestly believe if you walk on any field and you see bare soil, you're behind the game.
Did you say cover and armor?
Cover, armor, same thing. Yeah, we like calling it, some of us call it armor, some call it cover. Just think of it like your skin. Your skin protects the inside of your body. We need that protection. One of the reasons this is pretty dry up top is the lack of armor. Now, as it heats up later in the day, we'll pull out a thermometer and we'll do soil temperatures. It's not at all uncommon here, North Dakota, Minnesota, for us to get 85, 90 degree days and see soil temps 130 to all the way up 150. Okay, realize that 70 degree soil temp, all the moisture can be available to that plant. As soil temps start rising, then that plant starts shutting down. What are we in the business of doing as farmers and ranchers? Growing things, right? If that plant shuts down, how are we going to make money, right? Keeping soil temps down is critical. What else does that do? Well, that's the optimum temperature then for biology. And it's the biology that drives the nutrient cycle. What else does biology do? Right? And this just really baffles me how farmers and ranchers do not understand, and you're a little dry here, so it's a little tough, but what are these right here? These little, they're soil aggregates, of course. How long does soil aggregate last? Approximately. About 4 weeks. Okay? About 4 weeks, and then, oh, this is perfect, Joe, thank you. About 4 weeks, then we have to build new soil aggregates. What is a soil aggregate? What is it? Sand, silt, and clay particles being bound together, right? By the glues from biology and glomalin from mycorrhizal fungi. Look at that along this grass plant here. You see the rhizosheath, that interaction between that root and the soil? That's the new soil particles, new soil aggregates starting to be formed. Now, that's the interface there. If you don't have living plants, you're not building new soil aggregates. What did Joe tell us at the lodge? His goal is to have a living plant 365, right? How are these deep, rich prairie soils formed? living plants, 365. And these plants, you know, even though Joe can be under 2-3 feet of snow, those plants are still leaking some carbon compounds, helping to feed, if they're alive, helping to feed soil biology and help build those aggregates. Now, Gabe's going to go off on a tangent here. You got to forgive me. So, you know, I'm not bound to anybody. Unlike Abby, I can really say what I think. So, okay. What's one of the big issues we see, not only in the Red River Valley, we see it throughout Minnesota, much of the I-states. It's issues with water, right? So what are they doing? They're putting in their tile drainage, right? I had another word, but I left the adjective out, Joe, on that. Okay? Why do they need tile drainage? Because they no longer have aggregation. They're no longer able to infiltrate water. You know, drive I-29 and look at that land when it gets half an inch of rainfall. What do you see? It's covered with water, right? It won't infiltrate. Okay? Joe, have you done an infiltration test? I mean, you're dry now, but this is pretty good infiltration, I imagine you'd have here. Yep. So Joe doesn't have those issues because he can build soil aggregates. Now, these tiny aggregates along the rhizosheath here, those are the micro aggregates. The glomalin, once you have the fungal component, then you're going to build the macro aggregates. And it's those macro aggregates that are more stable. They're not going to be as prone to wind erosion, water erosion. Joe talked about how his father watched the fences be blown over with soil. Well, unfortunately, we're still seeing that today. As a matter of fact, I had a film crew at my place, true story, here late June, first week in July maybe. We had 3 days of sustained winds over 50 miles an hour from the west. My neighbor had chopped corn silage there last year, 2-foot tall corn, chopped it all, removed the residue, dished that field twice, planted soybeans, rolled it. Then those 3 days of that sustained wind, I've got 3-foot drifts of soil in my pastures. So just so happens I knew a film crew that was doing a documentary. I called them up and said, you need to get up here. And we filmed, it'll be released next year, documentary on soils. Fact of the matter is, that person has the exact same soil type that I have. It's management that makes the difference. Now the sad part, I can't resist going here, and I told this on the camera, and I'm sure it'll make the cut for the movie. The sad part is the U.S. taxpayer is going to pay him for crop insurance losses due to his poor management. That should not be allowed. That person should not be eligible for crop insurance, but I won't go there. That's not the reason for this tour. Okay. We as farmers and ranchers really need to understand how to build soil aggregates. And Abby and I briefly talked about this morning. How many times have you heard, but Abby, you don't understand, my soils aren't like this, right? But what they don't understand is they can change, not their soil types, but they can certainly change how their soil functions. That's a direct function of management. And I have been very arrogant on YouTube telling people, you don't believe it can be done on your farm, I'll bet you my ranch against yours. Now my son makes me stop that because it's now his ranch. And he says, Dad, you don't have a right to make that bet anymore. But anyway, I can do this anywhere in the world where there is soil, because it's simply the principles of nature. Now, what's the next one? We've talked about 3. What's the 4th? Diversity, right. How's Joe doing here for diversity? Pretty good. He's got a diverse crop rotation, right? He's planting cover crops in there. Diversity, though, I can't overstate the importance enough. If you're in a straight corn soybean rotation, your soil health is just declining, whether you want to believe it or not. I have the good fortune, I travel extensively I'm on hundreds of farms, ranches every year, all over the world. I have never, ever, not once stood on a single one, including my own, that's not degraded. They're all degraded and we're all on the slow plane of death. Now, regenerative practices, Joe, I'm willing to say you've advanced considerably since when you started, right?
Correct.
Yep. And your goal is to continue to advance. You know? And you can rest easy at night knowing Olivia will take it way beyond because she's way smarter than you, right?
That's correct also.
Yeah. But the goal is, we often hear this term out there, we want to be sustainable. Why in the hell would you want to sustain a degraded resource? That makes absolutely no sense. We can't afford as a society, you can't afford as a farmer and rancher to be sustainable. We need to be regenerative and build back, you know, so that future generations, they may have the opportunity to be sustainable. We can't do that anymore. Time's short supply. There's some really good pictures on YouTube of photos of the Dust Bowl back in the 30s. Guys, we're not much different than that now when you look. In June, I was driving just south of Grand Forks, North Dakota here. I had to stop on the interstate because the soil was blowing, well, the dirt was blowing so bad, you couldn't even see. You know, it's just appalling what's going on. The challenge for each of us, we got to look in the mirror. And we got to do what we can do on our own farms and ranches and move forward, okay? I can't dictate to you what you do. That's up to you to decide. But you have no right to complain about, oh, you know, my soil, I'm in a drought. This is happening, that's happening. My soil type ain't right. Look in the mirror and change it. Change your practices. Okay, Joe's doing a good job with diversity. What's the next principle? Living root. How's he doing? He said his goal was living root 365, and no, there's years he can't get there. We get those early snows, what have you. Mother Nature throws a curveball. But fact of the matter is, you can do a lot more. As you travel around, Abby, how many people, they get harvest off and that's it. Nothing growing, right? Vast majority of farmers and ranchers. What is growing of this plant here, these corn plants here, what percentage of their nutrients did Joe apply? What percentage of this plant growth comes from what Joe applied? Approximately. Somebody says 30. 10 would be very, very top limit. Even less than that, really. In a healthy functioning soil. Now, in a very degraded soil, yeah. Fact of the matter is, look at a tree. Look at a tree. How much of that comes from solar energy? How much comes from mineralogy in the soils? Right? Think about it. Okay? We're to the point today in production agriculture where the soil is nothing more than a medium to hold the plant upright. That's all it is in many cases. Okay? I have not applied a single pound of synthetics to my cropland since 2007. Not a single pound. I heard for years, Gabe, your system's going to crash, you're mining your soil. Really? When those roots, when I go to China and they come out the other end of the earth, maybe then I've mined enough. Fact of the matter is, now am I standing here telling Joe not to apply any? No, but fact of the matter, Joe's down to half a pound per bushel, and I know he can go even less than that, okay? Working with a young producer in north central North Dakota, within a almost throwing distance of Canada. I've been working with him, this is the 4th crop year. He's reduced his fertility inputs from 40 to 60%. 100% reduction in insecticide, 100% reduction in fungicides, okay? And he's still got ways to improve. If you focus on the principles, it happens that fast. Now that young family It's rented land. He's not able to integrate livestock, which is the final principle. Joe, I think you mentioned it this morning, you integrate livestock where you can onto the cropland acres, right?
Yep.
So about a third of the 33 million acres we consult on, people don't run livestock. They're in a strict crop rotation. Are we able to advance soil health and significantly increase profitability on those acres? Absolutely. But make no mistake about it, it's not going to get to as healthy a functioning ecosystem as where we can integrate livestock. Plain and simple. And that's due to the biology that's in the gut of an animal and the biology that's in the soil. We got to realize these prairie soils were formed with large herds of grazing animals, birds, much more insect diversity. Okay, we've lost that in agriculture. We need to get that back. So those are the 6 principles. Why do we focus on them? We focus on them to drive the 4 ecosystem processes. Energy cycle, taking that solar energy, putting it into the soil. That's what it's about. That's what feeds soil biology, which stimulates then the nutrient cycle. Because it's that biology in the soil that cycle the nutrients and make them available for the plants. And then, of course, it's the biology that build the soil aggregate that drive the water cycle. Okay, Joe, we didn't talk about organic matter levels here. I'm sure you've got an idea.
Dave Franson was doing nitrogen rate studies here over a 5-year period, and where we're standing is about 7%.
7% carbon. I can tell it's awfully high, and as dark as these soils are. That's excellent. That's excellent.
Across the farm, I'm closer to 6.
Yeah, but that's excellent. Now, case in point, though, Joe doesn't mind. We're good enough friends, even though this is the first time I've been down here, that I can tell them, Joe, what do you suppose your ecological context this once was? And maybe, Abby, you know the answer or have a pretty good idea.
What was the organic matter in the virgin prairie?
Yeah.
Probably 9.
Yeah, or a little higher, I'd say. Correct?
I think about 9.
9?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is tall grass prairie here.
Yeah. So, fact of the matter, it's still a degraded resource, correct? Sure it is. So that's my way of saying, Joe, you can do better. Okay. But see, I mean, the fact of the matter, though, is what does that do for Joe having 7% organic matter soils? For every 1% organic matter, you're going to hold between 18,000 and 27,000 more gallons of water per acre per foot of the soil profile. Think of what that does. That makes you resilient, much more resilient in a drought, right? It also, you get all those, that moisture, late spring snow. Were you in on that one this year? Did you get that April snowstorm we had out west? Or?
Not as much.
Okay. But I'm willing to bet that you can farm a much greater percentage of your cropland than can neighbors that till, correct?
I was able to get on, the county is about 35 to 40% prevent plant, and we are about 10%.
Okay. Is that going to make Joe money? Absolutely. Absolutely. So, what made Joe that money? His management, correct? But his management built this, stored this carbon in the soil, built it to these levels. He builds the soil aggregates. It's his management that makes a difference. See? It's not something he goes out and buys. It's how do you apply the principles to drive the processes.
So there's a cost to cover crops, but I certainly seem like on my farm there's been a beneficial aspect of covers. Not only soil armor, but moisture management. The moisture management part of it's actually huge for me. being able to go like, so next year, the next field we go to, or one of the next fields will be a soybean field. So just imagine next year I plant soybeans on this, and there's rye about knee high, and I'm planting green soybeans into it. And I've got a heavy cover of corn residue here and a heavy cover of rye residue here, and then there's soybeans planted in between. And I found the corn residue to do just as good of weed control because it's so much corn residue in a little space. It's just a total mulch cover. It does just as good a weed control as the rye does in between. So we think that that system is as good as a pre-emergent herbicide application, and it seems to work to that point too. We haven't been rolling, crimping our rye. There's a lot of debate, and I got a question for Gabe. You travel around in the Corn Belt where they're crimping rye quite a bit, and there's a debate going on whether it's beneficial to crimp it or not. And I'm kind of in between.
Yep.
I don't really want to buy the machinery if I don't need it.
So for you, I would recommend don't. I bought one way back in '09. I had one made, custom made, put on the front of my tractor and pull the drill, and so I could roll as I'm seeding. What I found after 5 years of trials, the earliest I could get that rye to where anthesis, where rolling, crimping would terminate it without the use of a herbicide, was June 12th. Okay? Not going to get a corn crop to maturity, or beans getting in that late. So I sold that. So then it becomes either livestock or herbicide. What we're finding is the vast majority of farmers, if they're not organic, even though they're rolling, they still are having to use a herbicide to terminate. Okay? Especially when we get into these multi-species covers, because you're not going to terminate hairy vetch with rolling, okay? So then you need a broadleaf herbicide in there to do that. The other thing we're finding actually for seed soil contact and plant stand, planting when that is standing does a better job than trying to cut that residue, because that residue can really give some hairpinning issues, etc.
And that's what we found too. So we're typically planting our soybeans when the rye is early boot. And that's usually mid-May, and then we allow the rye and the soybean to grow together for a while, and then we will terminate the rye generally when the soybeans are in the probably first true leaves or so, and but again, that'll be the first herbicide application that soybean field has had, and then we do roll for rocks and to just kind of get the corn stubble mulch down, but we don't roll until the beans are up. And we get a little bit of headland damage where we turn on the headlands when the beans are up with the roller, but out in the field there's no damage to the beans. And that's, even the conventional guys need to start figuring out when to roll. I mean, if they're gonna roll, they can't be rolling right after planting, because the state just lights up with, you could see it this spring. There were satellite views of fields blowing that time of the year. So the soil organic matters, when I started about 42 years ago, were around 4, which were pretty good. I mean, we had quit the plow in the late 60s and went to chisel plowing. And my dad, like I mentioned, had a diverse crop rotation all those years, so it wasn't just corn and beans. But they've come a full 2% across the farm. And with no-till, I kind of reached a plateau in about 8 or 10 years. And then I think the mineralization process just kind of got to a point where I wasn't going anywhere until I started adding more plants. And you don't know that until you do, right? Unless you go to some meeting and believe somebody like Gabe, Well,
and that you made a very good point, Joe. And people ask me often, well, Gabe, how much organic matter are you adding? each year. And I said, very little now. Think of it though, I'm utilizing. Jay Fear has a great saying. I mean, he came out with it years ago. Take your reward. Okay, you're building it. Why not cut back on the inputs? Take your reward, and the biology will consume some of that carbon. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. The thing is, we're not degrading. Now, we've been through 6 very dry years. The last 2 years were the 2 driest in history near Bismarck. Do you think I'm gaining anything? No, I slid the last 2 years. That's nature, okay? But, well, I tell you, we got covers and we got plants growing now with a little moisture this year because I need to build back. So don't get so hung up thinking you gotta see progression. There's other ways of progressing. You know, how about your predator insects? How about your soil aggregates, your water infiltration? And if you're in a drought, you're not building soil aggregates very quickly. It is tough, okay? Some years are like that. You just got to take them and roll with them. But when you can, take your reward. So what Joe's done here, moving from 4 to 7, I think is excellent.
Especially this far north.
Yeah, but this far north, I mean, okay, I'm going to get into this one now. So people use it as an excuse this far north. I have clients in Manning, Alberta. Do you know where Manning is? You fly into well, you were just there? Yeah, you fly into Edmonton Drive, you think you're going to hit the Arctic Circle, you're in Manning. Okay? And they're all covers, and there's some really exciting things going on with soil health there in the Manning area. And so that's a long ways north of us, you know. Farmers tend to use that as an excuse, okay? We can build soil health in the deserts. We can build it in advanced soil health in the deserts, advance it far north. It's just a matter of context, plain and simple.
So I typically terminate when the rye is early flower or mostly headed, kind of right in there. But it's a balance between moisture usage at that point. If it's a dry spring, I might terminate it earlier. If it's a wetter year and I want that rye to continue to consume some more moisture, I have gotten very comfortable with the soybean yield, whether I leave the rye or not. And generally, the more cover you grow, the more mulch you have. Soybeans aren't real great canopy years, so it takes them till early August to really canopy the field. So to have some soil armor and some mulch on the ground just preserves moisture throughout the growing season.
I think there are also farmers too in a really dry fall where you're concerned about what you might have in the spring, terminating those covers early, especially if it's vegetative and it might be easier to plant into. So logistics wise, if you're transitioning into these systems and you start getting nervous or you feel like it's using too much moisture, you always have the option with cover crops to terminate them. That's why they're so useful in these soil health systems, is because it's a commitment, but it's one that you can back out of at any point that you feel comfortable, or when you start feeling uncomfortable.
That's a very good point. But if you're in areas that's prone to a more brittle environment, drier, less moisture, you have to plant covers in order to build your soil aggregation organic matter so you can infiltrate more water. Because most of the people are not capturing but a small fraction of the rainfall that falls on their farms. If you're in a wetter environment, such as Joe, then you use them to use excess moisture. I mean, cover crops are a no-brainer. And Joe talked about the seed, and he's not going to like me hear me say this, but you're a farmer. Grow your own seed.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I totally agree.
Yeah.
If it makes economic sense for you.
Yeah.
Right?